Painting outdoors is something I've always thoroughly enjoyed. So the other night when I was feeling a little more caught up with some of my work, I thought I'd take that opportunity to get up into the hills and try and complete a painting with what daylight I had left. I set up in a nice meadow with a beautiful view of some distant mountains. The sky was quite hazy from some of the wildfire smoke, but it also created a nice atmospheric look to the horizon. I only have about 3 hours until sunset, and so I have to move quickly. I begin using some burnt sienna mixed with thinner to sketch out my idea onto the panel. I like using a makeup sponge in this part of the process to shade in and tone some of the areas of my canvas to establish more value and get a better idea of some of the contrasts that I'm trying to accomplish. Mixed with just a little bit of burnt sienna and blue, I begin filling in the sky first. Next, I grab a little more blue, mixed with a little more of the yellow and burnt sienna to create a nice warm bluish hue so I could get started with the mountains. I begin darker at first and then use some of the white mixture to start lightening up and creating separation between the mountains and rolling hills in the distance, which creates more depth to the picture overall. Within each layer of mountains, I try to keep the top half just a little bit darker than the lower half, which really enhances that feeling of atmosphere. Next, I begin mixing some of the colors that I'll use for the trees. I use phthalo blue and burnt sienna instead of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna to create a little more depth in some of my shadows. And then I use some orange and some yellow along with white to create some lighter, more greenish tones. In general, my process can change from painting to painting, but I try to work from back to front as much as I can. So I start with some of these distant trees that I can just barely see beneath the mountains. From there, I begin to work my way around it and expand into some of the darker trees off to the right, as well as those two larger trees on the left. With dusk quickly approaching, I know that the colors I see now in the landscape will change fairly quickly, so I have to think about what features and what colors I want to lay down first so that I don't lose sight of what I wanted to accomplish. So after getting a little bit of the trees laid down, as well as the mountains in the back, I quickly start adding the darkest of darks within my painting, which would be the shadows in the trees on the right. Now at this point, I have my brightest color as well as my darkest color laid down on the panel, and that'll help me in establishing a point of reference of value, which will help guide me as my light begins to change and as I begin to lose my light. The next thing I really want to capture in this piece before I lose it is the small amount of light hitting the tops of these trees, illuminating them, creating a nice yet subtle orange-yellow hue. I just love some of these subtle details within these tall, skinny pine trees. So I'm trying to capture as much of that as I can. I use my brush and manipulate it in all sorts of different ways for areas like this, using the pointed edge for sharp, small details, as well as the flat, longer edge to create blocks of color and coverage. With these larger trees, I notice the trunks illuminating much more than they did when I first sat down, and I can see that bright red bark starting to appear, which is what I really love about this scene. And so I'm trying to capture some of those highlights on the tree trunks before those disappear. At the same time, some of the pine boughs on these larger trees are starting to illuminate from the sun as well. And so I'm trying to establish some of the shadows as well as the highlights on these larger trees before moving on to some of the foreground. Instead of finishing those larger trees, I just get the colors that I need and the colors that I want to capture, establish, and then move on to the foreground as some of that grass is starting to illuminate as well. And I want to capture that bright, vibrant yellow before it fades. To mix this color, I use a combination of Indian yellow, titanium white, and some phthalo blue to give it a little bit of green. For the darker areas in the foreground, I just added more phthalo blue along with a little bit of burnt sienna to darken it down. And that created a nice aqua blue, yellowish tone, which is great for the shadows. Now I'm beginning to feel a little more confident with being able to capture everything I want to capture before I run out of daylight. So now it's just a matter of filling in some of the spaces, mixing the colors that I've already mixed previously, and continuing to work some of those areas that are unfinished. And so first I go back to the larger trees and begin to start adding some of the highlights, and then I'll move to some of the shadows to start filling that in as well. Before those trees are finished, I also want to show some of the light coming through those trees. So I'll add some of the color of the sky in and amongst those larger trees as well as the smaller trees to the right. It's difficult at this point to continue to keep working and layering as the wet paint doesn't always cooperate. And so a lot of times it can get muddy, it can start to mix together when you want it to layer. And so it's important to know when enough is enough and when to call it quits on any given spot. But I just continue to do my best, slowly but surely, as long as I have daylight. I really enjoy the process of being out here. I enjoy the process of doing everything I can with what time I have left. And so I just embrace the day and continue to poke at the painting until my light fades and the day's over. Once I was back in my studio, the following day the painting had dried and I mixed some of the same colors that I had while out there. And I just wanted to add some subtle details within the shadows, and I wanted to brighten up some of my highlights. It oftentimes is difficult to get the really bright highlights as well as the details within those shadows. Between the light reflecting on the canvas and just colors blending into each other, you can kind of lose some of that. But in the end, I was very happy with how this painting came out. I hope you enjoyed this process. If you'd like to watch me complete this painting in real time with some more in-depth instruction, click the join button and check out my YouTube memberships right below the video, or check out the video description below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.